So, a quick introduction. So, I am James Beveridge, MD and co-founder of Pebble Studios. So, Pebble is a 40-seat creative technology studio based just up the road in Shoreditch. We established in 2011. Back then, our main services really were sort of film, animation, and VFX. And our journey over the last sort of seven or so years have seen us kind of move much more towards a creative technology studio, specialising in kind of more meaningful, deeper level customer and content experiences. So that covers both sort of high-end CGI through to kind of VR, AR, MR, and kind of many other Rs that you'll probably hear about over the next couple of days. But it's been I've got to say, the last kind of 4 years or so since we bought the first kind of Oculus DK2 kit has been really quite inspiring. We have had some that worked, that's good. We've had some great successes and been to some interesting places, from helping Disney XD relaunch DuckTales to kind of both audiences new and old. We built Europe's largest 360 screen for Live Nation at the Milton Keynes Bowl. We launched the UK's first immersive gym studio. We went to the bottom of the seabed and also kind of took whiskey fans in Asia to the rugged island of Islay with Bowmore. And most recently, and kind of most sort of unexpectedly, we also went to the world's largest ganja farm, which was very exciting. It's a top secret location, but it is in the UK. We are the world's largest exporter of cannabis. You probably didn't know that, but it is all for health purposes, particularly treating epilepsy. And it was actually quite an eye-opening experience going to that space. I think what that hopefully highlights is that I think once we kind of moved, not necessarily beyond pure film and animation, but kind of worked on top of our experience in film and animation, the virtual reality briefing and opportunities that came our way really did open up this whole new world of places and things that we could do, but also a whole new way of telling stories and a whole new approach to kind of crafting experiences for audiences which we were always intending to make feel like nothing else they would ever really experience in any other medium. There's a quick show reel here which probably won't play through your headphones, but will play through the speakers. So those projects are all very much from the last kind of two or three years. They vary both in their kind of technical complexity, but also the way that we went about crafting the ideas and the concepts for them as well. But I think it's important just to sort of take one step back and really ask ourselves where the industry is. The aim here is to talk a little bit around taking VR beyond just eye candy, but also beyond tech for tech's sake. And I think that's where it has been, or certainly was for a good few years. unfortunately, our view is that we're very much, past that stage. And if we look at the Gartner hype cycle, our view is that we've kind of gone through the sort of peak of inflated expectations, the trough of disillusionment, and we've kind of bumbled our way to the slope of enlightenment, which I think, some people have often asked the question, is VR actually going to survive at all? And I think, that was never really the right question for those who have used the technology. The right question really was, what are the real uses for it? And how should that influence our creative decision making, but also our kind of R&D investment decision making? So we're on the slope of enlightenment, but it really wasn't all that long ago that we were sort of back at the peak of inflated expectations. There was obviously talk of VR being in every household. Everyone was going to have a headset. There was a lot of stats flying around from Oculus and Facebook and the big investors. Anyone familiar with VR will also be aware of the sort of atrocious stock imagery that flies around, sort of Shutterstock and Getty and the like, and shows just how excited it obviously was intending to be. This guy's sort of so excited by it, he's sort of lying on his floor. But the idea was that we were never going to leave the sort of comfort of our sofas, and that we'd go on holiday from our home, and that kids wouldn't have to live in the real world, because why would you? Look how excited this guy is. He can't believe his luck. He doesn't have to go and make friends or kind of practice his handwriting. He can sort of live in outer space. So understandably, we're all getting very excited by these sort of developments. But the sort of reality was that none of that really materialised. None of that happened. I think those closest to the industry actually probably knew that was going to be the case. But I think the sort of the pushback against VR also coincided with a sort of wider development in consumer trends. And I think sometimes VR can almost be this scapegoat for technology influencing us at this sort of seemingly uncontrollable speed. I think partly it's probably the physicality of the headset and how it, we can see that it removes us from the real world, and that scares us. I mean, there's this idea of us no longer kind of interacting socially, but sort of disconnecting from the real world. And I think that combined with this growing fear and awareness of data and how that is influencing our lives, often without us knowing, this idea that our lives are being sort of predetermined by technology. I think to some extent VR has almost been the most visible scapegoat of that. We can't see the data that's influencing us, but we can see something sort of strapped to our head that clearly disconnects us from each other. So it's almost acted as a scapegoat with a number of sort of naysayers. And that sort of coincides with the realities of how, as individuals and as sort of as audiences, we're increasingly aware of how technology is influencing our lives. From this stat suggesting that sort of 62% fear how much we are connected to our phones, and this is being the kind of awareness of this is growing. I think with the likes of the screen time application, which is now on all iOSs, we're getting the data through showing just how connected we all are to our devices. That's my one, which I'm not sure if that's good or bad. The fact that sort of BBC Sports number 2 is quite telling, or the sort of the nasty little yellow app that my girlfriend calls it. But we're kind of aware of this, and I think the kind of pushback and the sort of negative impacts are being realised. And the sort of Guardian recently released that 33% of adults kind of have tried a digital detox. And I think we can probably agree that that's a trend which is going to start growing as we learn more about what technology is really doing to us in the real world. So what does this mean for immersive technologies? It would appear that as VR does emerge from this trough of disillusionment, humans are sort of simultaneously kind of fighting back. We had these fears of becoming digital sort of cyborgs. Perhaps a lifestyle more associated with the past is actually where we are in fact moving to. The rise of experiences in crafts, in understanding the provenance of our goods and services. Our consumption is actually increasingly meaningful, as much as sometimes the what we may read in the press doesn't necessarily sort of reflect that. So what we're discovering actually is that people prefer to connect than to disconnect. We could be transported anywhere. We could never leave our sofa. But ultimately, we actually like leaving our sofa. And what we're learning is that in some instances, actually, it's actually quite hard to beat real life. And we've often tried to shoehorn virtual reality into the real world, where it perhaps doesn't really have a place. If we take broadcast sort of entertainment VR as an example, I think I'd probably say that this, may well be the one which has certainly had a lot of investment, but perhaps has fallen most short relative to expectations. Not to say it hasn't been worth attempting, but when it comes to watching sport or music, we already have a number of options. We go to stadiums, we find the pub with our mates, or we watch it on TV, and the reality is, actually all of these experiences are brilliant, and they've been honed over decades. So, the reason we go to a stadium, it certainly isn't for the live view, because you can't really see what's actually going on. We go for that sense of being connected to the crowd around us, and this idea, this sense of a kind of heightened emotion that comes from feeling the vibrations of the stadium, of the crowd, and having people around us. And the same goes for the pub. This is a moment from the World Cup. You remember I was in the Old Blue last, just up in Shoreditch, with a number of friends, when Kieran Trippier stepped up, and everyone kind of went mad and got covered in beer, and couldn't really see the screen properly, had arms in the way, and ended up getting absolutely soaked. But wouldn't have changed that for the world. Obviously, I would have changed the result, but not the experience. And I think if we compare that to virtual reality at the World Cup, really, the examples of it, done by the BBC, which I think, is very admirable for trying to push this. But the reality is the experience you're getting is almost like this idea of an exclusive kind of VIP box, but you haven't got any mates there, and you haven't got any beer there, and you're kind of watching, but you're kind of behind a net. And your view probably isn't quite as good as if you're watching on TV, but the atmosphere isn't ultimately quite as good as if you were kind of watching in the stadium. So it's just not ultimately quite hitting our expectations of what the real world already delivers for us. But does that mean that there's no place in sport, as an example, for VR? Well, no, not at all. I think if we look at the likes of Striver, which is being used, the benefit of VR really is that it can put you right in amongst the action. And whilst that may not always be the best fan experience in terms of watching live sport, well, it can be an amazing training tool, and actually Striver are proving to do this, certainly in the NFL, and also they're being used by the Scottish rugby team at the moment, where key decision makers, such as quarterbacks or fly halves, are using the technology to make far more immediate, rapid decisions, and also remember their moves far better. I think this is Carson Palmer of the Arizona Cardinals, who says it's ultimately a better way of watching film, and that he spends almost as much time on Striver as he does on the playbook, going through different reads and progressions. It's a huge part of what he now does, and that is both putting him in the real world, helping him understand the real world better, but also that connection to his memory, which will enable him to make faster, quicker, more informed decisions on the pitch. The guys at Striver are suggesting that, well, their data reflects that teams have an improved recollection of concepts by 30%. So what we're starting to see is that as our understanding of value is sort of shifting beyond inflated expectations, like perhaps sports broadcasting arguably is, and towards a slope of enlightenment, the areas that are succeeding are the ones where the real world itself still has something to be desired. These are areas where living can actually be enhanced by the technology and the content that we're creating. And there's a few examples that I'd like to talk through, albeit briefly, before moving on to what our kind of recommendations are for creating content in these spaces. But firstly, out-of-home entertainment and experiential, training and education, B2b marketing, and social media. And I think it's fair to say the top two are very well documented, and I think perhaps they're the most glamorous and exciting to some extent, and the most emotive, certainly in terms of what we might be reading in the press. But there are also some underserviced areas where virtual reality is proving to be kind of highly effective. So just to quickly flip through these, out-of-home entertainment and experiential, I think we're probably all aware of what, the Void among others are doing, but ultimately what we're talking about here is things like theme parks and branded experiences, high footfall locations where, customers are looking for their next challenge. And I think what we're discovering is that the real world has limits here. So if it's a roller coaster, the limit is how fast you can accelerate, how high you can go on that roller coaster. But the reality of what the technology can do is it can take that physical experience and turn it into an emotional one as well, and take us to places we never thought might be possible, like Galactica has done at Alton Towers. And I think the reason why this works, one of the reasons why this works so well, and particularly if we look back at it relative to when we talked about a headset being in every household, the problem with that is that we can't control the technology that's in the hands of the people we're creating content for. In this instance, we have absolute control of that technology, in the quality of it, in the timing of it, in the experience of it. And really that's a bit of a common theme across some of these other areas, including particularly education and B2b marketing. So looking at training and education, I won't spend too long on this again because I think it really is quite self-explanatory. And if we look at Google Expeditions, there are now 900 locations on there that can open up kids' classrooms to this whole world around them. And I think most of us would probably agree that we'd rather have sort of David Attenborough talking to us than a sort of corduroy-clad geography teacher, and that the one field trip a year that we might go on in a sort of soggy Isle of Wight is perhaps better replaced by multiple kind of almost daily or certainly weekly experiences that can open up kids' minds to what is actually possible in the world now. So B2B marketing now. We do a reasonable amount of B2B, and I think it's fair to say that it's for quite a long time been sort of the embarrassment of the marketing world. People, sort of don't like to, when they say they work in marketing, they often don't talk about the B2B bit because they're worried about what everyone might think about them. But the reality is, business is kind of fast becoming, cool again. I think businesses are as an exciting place to be as they've probably ever been. And when it comes to immersive technologies, the reason why B2B is such a compelling area to explore is because ultimately what we're talking about are typically low volume and high value customers, and that's really where we are finding that immersive technologies are at their best. I think when we spend a lot of money and expect tens and tens of thousands or millions of people to experience our content in an immersive way, the chances are that probably isn't going to happen. It's certainly not in a short term. It might do over multiple years if you're a theme park or a kind of branded experience, but not in a short term. In B2B, you've got very high value customers. If you're talking, you could be talking kind of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pounds for a deal that can be done in the B2B space. That's where it really is worth investing in very high quality content. Whether it's for a one-off if the value is high enough, or something that can be transported globally to various markets, suddenly you're starting to see sort of significant value in where the technology is not only making you more memorable, but also differentiating relative to the competition. I think if we look at that's a spot on the bottom left-hand corner, I think the other thing to recognise here is that the reality is, we might look at that as a trade show and go, well, how do trade shows still exist? I mean, it's an absolute mess of messaging and kind of sort of tiny little sort of 3 meter square plots. But no one's come up with a better solution to trade shows. People like to meet face to face. They like to walk around and explore. My mistake. They like to explore. They like to connect with one another. The problem is when you hit that when you go into that 3x3 space, ultimately it's typically a very kind of mediocre and far from compelling experience. There might be a plasma screen on the wall that plays some kind of company film, but they're just not exciting, not compelling. The beauty of immersive technologies is not only that actually they still do draw a crowd, but also they enable you to kind of blow the doors off that 3x3 space and take people well out of that trade show. So you end up with the best of both worlds. That face-to-face real-world connection that a trade show brings, but when they're with you, you can take them on a kind of completely unique and immersive journey that makes them forget they are surrounded by thousands of people in London's XL or wherever you might be. So an example of this, and when I say that B2B is certainly or can be perceived as less glamorous, we worked fairly recently with an agricultural supplier called Syngenta, who may not be as sort of may not seem as exciting as some of the work we've done for Disney, Samsung, and others. But I can assure you, if you're a farmer, this is like no other experience you will ever have. The ability to get sort of up close and personal with a combine harvester, to really understand the details of spreading sort of agricultural products and how that all works, it is actually something which we may not always appreciate in our kind of agencies and sort of soft spaces of London. But if you understand your audience well enough and you realise that actually they do find it hard to sometimes comprehend really the sort of the science and the technicalities of these very particular products, in the same way actually that I showed the kind of medical grade cannabis farm earlier. This is quite well, is certainly a compelling story. And in fact, our client services director, Mark, his uncle is a farmer, and he went to the trade show where this was played, and his view was he had never seen anything like it before, this combine harvester in virtual reality. Great to see Syngenta doing something innovative that actually helps farmers understand the benefits of their product. And I think that's really what we're trying to get to the heart of, is let's understand our audience first, and let's look at really whether this is the right technology for them and how memorable an experience it can then be. And then finally, social media. So I think the purist amongst us would agree that social media is not always perceived as a immersive technology when we're talking about Facebook and YouTube 360. But as we recognise that sort of content trends are revealing, social media going through this period of kind of self-reflection, that the data is actually showing, that this isn't good for us, this constant connection we have to our devices. And perhaps the trend we're seeing in unfollowing and logging off and generally being more considerate of our time online is also quite nicely dovetailing with a rise, or what we're certainly anticipating is a rise in high quality content, and the idea that actually rather than this sort of fish and chip paper Instagram sort of grab someone in 2 seconds content that we've been sort of pushing out for ultimately too many years, really that sort of work has been the reason why people are logging off. And I think what we're seeing is the more mindful consumer is actually looking for a better, higher value and more meaningful content experience when they do log on. And as we sort of stop, frequently increasingly people are stopping their sharing on kind of public channels, and they're sharing much more in their private channels. They're only really going to be sharing that content if it is of a very, very high value to them. It's an experience that they really feel is going to stand out amongst everything else. This kind of 15-second Instagram ad is never going to ultimately be that. I appreciate sometimes they have a different purpose. But ultimately what we really want is for that sort of less time to become better spent time, and that's where we feel that social 360, whilst not necessarily immersive, can, if we put our storytelling hat on, actually be an incredibly immersive story when we realise the person using it is in control of that adventure. And the DuckTales one that I showed earlier had a really lovely kind of review from an online fan, which went into far more detail than I think we did when we were concepting it. But it certainly picked up on a lot of things that we recognised, and shows that if you do go that extra that extra distance for the fans. They will pick up on it, they will share it, they will talk about it, and they'll appreciate that extra effort. And you might need to take your headphones off for this.
Thought you'd have to wait until DuckTales August 12th premiere to see the new adventures of Uncle Scrooge and his family? I did too, but Disney XD's YouTube channel just gave us an incredible sneak peek, and you can watch it in 360 degrees. The Disney XD DuckTales reboot has a lot of great previews. Full-length scenes from D23 Expo and Comic-Con, a bunch of short teasers, and even a great prequel comic. But this was the last thing I expected. On July 29th, the channel uploaded a 360-degree video to YouTube that follows Scrooge and the kids on a short adventure to recover the lost key of Tra-La-La. This is different from previews we've seen before. This is special. Not just because it's using YouTube's 360-degree video feature to let you look around the scene and explore the world of DuckTales for yourself, but because it's something exclusive. Everything we've seen up until this point are clips that are eventually going to be in the TV show. But this is something separate. It's a YouTube exclusive clip that we're not going to see in the final show. And it's really cool. More than anything though, I'm just impressed with the animation in this sequence. Making an enjoyable and watchable 360-degree video experience is hard enough in real life with 360 cameras. But making a wraparound window into a 2D animated world is an incredible undertaking. And the DuckTales team executed it beautifully here. I love how the camera follows the action around automatically, but still gives you plenty of reason to look around. Using a thrown knife to direct you to look for Glumghoul's car, or having the kids direct you to look into the sky to find Launchpad's plane. I also like the extra details of the money bin. In the office, you can see Scrooge's ancient stock ticker and his #1 dime hiding under glass. Even better, if you look behind the scenes, you can see Scrooge's desk and a huge painting of him in overalls, working hard to make his fortune. Even more though, I really love how the 360 clip showcases how the show is using mixed media. Scrooge and the kids are all traditionally animated, but a lot of the clip is done with 3D models. That's not too out of the ordinary, but it's impressive how well those 3D elements blend with the traditional animation. Sure, you can still tell that the trees in the background, the cars, and the plane are all computer generated, but for the most part, they all blend together really well. And that's a huge accomplishment. Traditional 2D animation and 3D elements usually don't look right together, but this looks really good. It gives me a lot of hope for the show. I'll probably pour over this clip in more detail in the coming weeks, but if you haven't seen it, please go watch it, and watch it on a phone if you can. Hold your phone in front of you and it'll automatically pan around the scene in 3D space as you move. It's a really fun experience, and it's totally worth your time. I'm really happy the DuckTales crew shared this with us. It's an extra promo that probably took a lot of work to make, work that doesn't help make any specific episode, so making it was completely unnecessary. But it's awesome. Go check it out. Oh, but before you do, please hit up those like and subscribe and share buttons. You know, if you want. I'm having a great time doing this DuckTales stuff, and subscribing really helps me out. No worries if you don't feel like it though. Until next time, take it easy, Internet.
So I can assure you we didn't commission this guy. No idea who he is. We did not commission him to make that. But it was probably, I don't know. I think in the 7 years that we've been going, that maybe discovering that on YouTube was probably the highlight of everything we've ever done. You know, aside for, you know, you can win awards and things, but when a super fan kind of takes the time to make something like that, and almost kind of helps you do that educational job to other fans, you know, when Disney saw that, they couldn't quite believe that someone had actually taken that time and really analysed it in that deep level. And then I think when we talk about this content that kind of reaches people at a sort of much deeper and more meaningful level, you know, this is when it's really worth making that extra investment, or pushing a client to go that bit further to make something that people really do care about and appreciate the extra effort that's gone into it. So are sort of three pillars of effective storytelling in VR. You know, we've talked about areas which often have which are increasingly showing the most success. But what we would argue connects content across all of those. Firstly is craft, and I think we can't really stress this enough. I think it's very easy to gloss over or cut corners when it comes to quality, and sometimes, particularly when we're trying to sell in a technology which takes time to deliver, quite often what we do in creating that content is actually we then kind of take, in order to deliver a sort of a technically challenging project, we often take away from the crafting element of it. And that really undermines the point of doing it in the first place. Our view is that, ultimately if you're looking to immerse someone, really what you're trying to do is take them out of the real world. And the more that they can see in that experience that they are in a virtual world, the less they really feel that sense of immersion. And yes, I think, if people would really think about it, they would know that they've got a headset on and they're kind of watching something which might have been computer generated or filmed. But actually, if we do our jobs really well, they actually forget that. And that's really what that's the aim. When people forget that actually, do you know what, this has been made for me, this has been created, and actually for them to feel the experience rather than looking around for kind of examples of why it's been kind of computer generated for them. And we did this for a project for ABC television in LA for a trailer for a new series of theirs called Time After Time, where we took audiences on a journey through time from Victorian London through to modern day New York. And the brief to ourselves really was that we wanted people at some point to feel that maybe, just maybe, they were travelling through time, which we appreciate is a big creative ask. But if you put the headset on, you genuinely feel for a split second that maybe you've just travelled through time. And I think in that instance we really did hit our objective. But it didn't come without some pretty sort of significant effort, a sort of burning of the midnight oil to make everything look as realistic as possible. And here's a quick making of from behind the scenes. There's a slightly aggressive soundtrack on that one. I think we might have slightly disrupted the talk going on downstairs. But this one was very much about the detail. It was about doing our research into what that Victorian street scene might look like in kind of 1800s London. Fortunately, we're based just down the road from Spitalfields and frequently in Soho, and actually kind of did some of our own kind of first-person research on that front. But also making sure that there are the right number of hot dog carts in Times Square and everything in between. Really ensuring that the viewer was sort of feeling that experience rather than just kind of seeing it. So second is empathy. Now I think arguably this is the true power of VR, the fact that it enables you to look through the eyes of someone else. We are ultimately living in a time where no one really seems to understand each other, and there's a lot of divisive politics, and actually people are often kind of feels unwilling to really understand what it's like to be in someone else's shoes. And what we're discovering really is that VR is perhaps one of the greatest mediums for enabling empathy that we've ever seen. There have been some very good examples already done from a kind of filmic point of view, from going to war zones to understanding what it's like to be bullied, to helping kind of old people revisit their past, and also understand the minds of the kind of crazy minds of children. But I think what I'd like to explore in the next example is actually where the fact that really empathy is quite a complex. It's more complex perhaps than we would perhaps recognise from these examples, because what these examples do brilliantly is they put you looking through the eyes of perhaps someone else. But we know the mind itself is actually quite a complex organ, and actually those anxieties aren't necessarily the same for every person. And whilst we might see through the eyes of someone, someone who may be experiencing those anxieties may have a heightened sense of what that visual actually is. And this example was is a bit of a breakdown, where we worked with a B2b pharmaceutical company to help them promote their catheter product. And actually what we discovered from our insight and research is the level of anxiety that, the sort of daily level of anxiety that catheter users actually suffer. And what we wanted to do in this instance is create an analogy to that anxiety. And for this we used the idea of a high dive board. What we also realised is that where we could have shot this, we could have filmed it in some kind of, well, we did actually look at some locations for it. It wouldn't really give us that heightened sense of anxiety that recreating it in CGI did, where we were actually able to double the height of a standard 10-meter board. You can't find diving boards that high, but in CG, you can recreate them, and really that enabled us to not only see through the kind of the eyes of the user, but actually kind of create that heightened sense of anxiety. And finally, imagination. So this is our third recommendation. Storytelling in VR really does enable us to explore imagination in all its non-linear glory. And the more we encourage exploration like this, the more we then also personalise the adventure. And we did this for Star versus the Forces of Evil, which sort of came off the back of the DuckTales project that we did, where not only did we take people on this this kind of social media 360 adventure, but within it we kind of hid clues and encouraged kind of fans of the show to seek out those clues, discuss, comment online, and almost have their own mini experience of that episode. And that was part born out of the insight from the DuckTales video that I showed from the guy who went to the extent of analysing every kind of small detail. We realised that actually what he enjoyed most was rewatching it and looking through it over and over again, discovering things he hadn't discovered the first time, which is what this medium is so good for. And we thought we'd use that insight in this to create this kind of virtual treasure hunt for kids. And so within this experience there are a huge number of kind of items that we encourage fans to try and find, which then were essentially acted as clues for the upcoming series. And again, this is this is actually really loud, this one. So again, this is a breakdown of this experience. So yeah, it's a totally weird show anyway. So it lent itself very well to kind of exploring this creative storytelling. Yeah, we worked quite closely with the maker of the show. You know, we wrote the script with them, and then worked on the kind of character development with them. But it was just great fun to kind of put ourselves into the mind of these floating unicorn heads and cats with human faces and other weird and wonderful creatures that we were able to explore. So I suppose as a quick summary, what I would really like to, hopefully for you to take away from this talk, is that before anything else, I think what we've sometimes failed to do is put the audience first in our content creation in immersive technologies. And sometimes we've tried to shoehorn the technology in for technology's sake, or we've thought maybe this would make a better experience, but we haven't really considered how good the real world already is in that environment. And that's really where we feel the opportunity is. But to deliver on that, it requires us to really craft our experiences and take the time and put the investment into making something special. We should also look at harnessing empathy and realise that, you know, VR really is the most, we would argue, the most compelling way of empathising with someone that we've ever seen. And finally, that we need to explore our imaginations further, because this idea of our minds themselves being fragmented and non-linear lends itself so well to what we can create in the virtual world. And that this kind of non-linear nature of immersive experiences allows of the exploration of the mind that really other mediums can only dream of. And that is that. Thank you very much for listening. Thanks for coming along. Sorry about the technicalities at the beginning. I appreciate we ran over a little bit, so I don't know if we have time for questions, but happy to field any afterwards. I'll be kind of in and around the area.